The village was a place where strength was carved into every ritual, every story, every expectation. To survive there was to be hard, unyielding, and loud enough to command attention. Boys were raised with spears in their hands and girls were measured by how much weight they could carry, how firmly they could work the earth, or how loud their laughter could rise in the market. Weakness was not simply frowned upon, it was condemned, treated as a curse upon one's lineage, a shame that could ripple through generations. Strength was their law, their pride, and their cruelest weapon against those who did not meet their measure. And so, when the girl was born into this world, small and frail, she was immediately branded as lesser. From her earliest days the villagers whispered about her. "She will not last," the old women said when they saw her stumble under a water pot. "Her bones are too light," the men muttered when she could not lift the bundles her peers carried with ease. Children mocked her, giving her names that cut sharper than thorns, laughing at her slowness, her thin arms, the way her breaths came quick after running short distances. Even her own family struggled with shame, their pride bruised by a daughter who did not reflect the village's ideal of strength. But while the mockery stung, the girl learned silence. She did not lash out when the laughter swelled around her. She did not defend herself when others spoke cruelly of her. Instead, she tucked her hurt into the quiet corners of her heart, letting it harden into something sharper than anger, endurance. She learned to bow her head when the village jeered, to move softly when others expected noise, to wait rather than strike. Her strength was not in her body but in her patience, though no one around her recognized it. What the villagers did not see was the depth of her eyes, the way they lingered too long on shadows, listening to whispers others could not hear. They did not notice how she stayed longer by the fireside, staring at the flames as if she could read their movements. Nor did they realize that when the elders spoke of ancient stories, of spirits that walked between the living and the unseen, of secrets buried beneath the earth, the girl's face changed. She was not bored like the others. She was listening. Always listening. Her quiet endurance was mistaken for weakness, but inside her lived a stillness that gathered strength like coals waiting beneath ash. Even when her steps slowed or her hands trembled, there was something in her presence that unsettled those who looked too closely. The elders dismissed it as nothing, the children ignored it, but a few old women sometimes paused when she passed, their eyes narrowing as though they sensed something beneath her silence. The village measured worth in muscle and loud voices, but the girl carried secrets in her silence, though she did not yet know what they were. She felt them sometimes like a hum in her bones, a pulse in her veins that quickened when she was pushed too far. She would return home after a day of being mocked and sit alone in the corner of her hut, pressing her palms together, whispering words she did not fully understand. It was as though something deep inside her was awake, waiting for the moment when it would no longer be hidden. The whispers of the village followed her everywhere. "She will not survive. She is too weak. She brings shame." Yet, beneath their scorn, she carried herself with a strange dignity. She did not rise to their bait, did not fight for scraps of respect. She simply endured, and in that endurance lay a mystery none of them could see. For strength in the village was always measured in what one could show, but hers was growing in the unseen, in the quiet shadows of her spirit, where true power often begins. And though she did not yet know it, the girl who was mocked as weak would one day carry secrets so heavy and so fierce that they would shake the very roots of the village that had dismissed her. The mockery never stopped. It was as constant as the sun rising over the hills, as familiar as the dust that clung to bare feet. From the moment the girl was old enough to join in the daily work, the ridicule began to carve its place into her life. When other children carried baskets of cassava, laughing at their strength, hers slipped from her hands and spilled across the dirt. Laughter followed her like a shadow. "See how the basket is stronger than she is," one boy shouted and the others echoed it, their voices a chorus of cruelty. Her family was no refuge. Her father, a man who prided himself on his broad shoulders and the way others deferred to him, avoided her gaze when she faltered. Her stepmother's lips curled into scorn whenever the girl entered the room. Even the siblings who might have defended her remained silent, fearful of being dragged into the same pit of shame. Around the evening fire, when others boasted of their day's work or shared stories of courage, her voice was drowned out. If she tried to speak, the elders waved their hands dismissively. "Quiet," they would say. What could she know of strength? Exclusion became a familiar weight. When rituals were held to bless the harvest, she was told to stand at the edge, away from the center where others danced and sang. When decisions were made about who would tend the fields, who would guard the goats, who would be chosen to learn sacred chants, her name was never spoken. Even the smallest tasks, the ones given to children barely older than toddlers, were withheld from her. She became a shadow in her own home, visible but unwanted, present but unacknowledged. The elders were harshest of all. They were the keepers of tradition, the guardians of stories that valued resilience and brute strength. To them she was a blemish, a reminder that not all children grew into the mold the village demanded. "She will break under the weight of her own breath," one of them sneered once, not caring that she sat only a few feet away. The others chuckled, as if her pain were entertainment, as if her existence were a joke. Each word pressed deeper into her heart, heavy as stone. The pain built quietly within her. On the outside, she lowered her head and pretended their words did not cut. On the inside, every slight, every insult, carved its mark into her spirit. She carried them with her when she went to fetch water, when she crouched to tend the small garden behind her hut, when she lay awake at night listening to the distant laughter of others who belonged. Her silence was not acceptance, it was survival. The more they pushed her down, the deeper she learned to hide her anger and her longing, storing them in a place they could not reach. And yet, their judgment shaped her in ways they did not expect. She grew careful, observant, watching the movements of others with an intensity that came from always being left outside. She noticed things the others overlooked: the way the wind shifted before rain, the way a shadow stretched differently when the fire's flames wavered, the way voices carried secrets in the pauses between words. Her exclusion made her invisible, but in invisibility she found clarity. Still, there were moments when the cruelty threatened to crush her. When she sat alone while others prepared for festivals, when she felt her body tremble from exhaustion after tasks that seemed effortless to others, despair whispered to her. What if they were right? What if she truly was weak? The thought burned in her chest, heavy and suffocating. But even in those moments, another whisper lingered beneath it, softer yet persistent: endure. Wait. The villagers believed they had measured her and found her lacking, but they did not see what they were forging. Every laugh, every insult, every exclusion pressed against her like a hammer on metal. And though she bent, though she seemed fragile and breakable, something inside her was hardening. They thought their mockery made her smaller, but in truth, it was shaping her into something they could not yet imagine. They dismissed her as weak. They judged her as worthless. But within her, the weight of their scorn was being transformed, turning into a secret strength they would one day fear. They had always whispered about her, laughed at her behind cupped hands, and dismissed her as though she were made of smoke. But whispers and laughter turned to plotting the moment envy curdled into hatred. It was not enough for them to mock her. They needed to erase her, to ensure that her shadow never rose high enough to darken theirs. And so, in the stillness of hushed meetings and narrowed eyes, a plan was born. It began with the young women of the village, those who had always despised her quiet resilience. They were strong in body, quick with their tongues, and certain of their place in the world. Yet whenever she walked past with her calm eyes and steady silence, they felt unsettled. She carried no loud strength, but there was something about her presence that unsettled them, as if she knew something they did not. Their mockery, which once felt satisfying, no longer eased their unease. "She is too quiet," one muttered. "Quietness hides secrets. What if she is hiding power?" Another hissed back, "Better to snuff her out now before she grows teeth." Their envy tangled with the whispers of elders who despised her difference. To them, her very existence was a challenge to tradition. If strength was measured by weight lifted or fields tilled, then how could a girl who carried only silence and watchfulness deserve any place in their world? The elders cloaked their resentment in the language of ritual and custom, insisting that the village must be cleansed of weakness, that those who cannot endure must not burden the strong. The villagers listened, fearful of opposing the elders, yet curious to see how such words would fall upon her shoulders. And so betrayal took shape. It was announced as a test, though it was nothing less than a death sentence. The elders declared that the girl would be sent out into the wildlands at night, where the forest crept close to the village edge, filled with creatures and spirits said to feast on those too frail to protect themselves. "If she survives," they said, their voices carrying authority that brooked no dissent, "then she has proven her strength. But if she does not, then it is only the way of things, the weak cannot walk among us." The villagers nodded, some grimly, some eagerly, others uneasily. It sounded like tradition, but it tasted like cruelty. The girl listened in silence as the decree was spoken. Her stepmother smirked from the shadows, her rivals avoided her eyes, and her father remained silent, bound by his fear of standing against the elders. It was betrayal not only by those who envied her but also by those who should have defended her. The betrayal wrapped her in its cloak, thick, suffocating and cold. On the evening of her casting out, the entire village gathered. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the firelight flickered across faces both eager and uncertain. She was led to the edge of the wildlands, her wrists bound not with rope but with shame, her voice silenced not by gag but by the weight of abandonment. They did not need to touch her with cruelty, the ritual itself was cruelty enough. Her rivals taunted her openly. "Now we will see if your silence can protect you," one jeered. Another leaned close, her breath hot and bitter. "Perhaps the spirits will find you tasty. Perhaps they will carve your bones into charms." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. The elders did not laugh. They stood stern, their eyes cold as stone. To them this was justice cloaked as tradition, an end they believed she deserved. They spoke the words of dismissal, their chants echoing into the night. "You are cast out. You are left to the spirits. If you return, you are no longer one of us." The fire crackled as if mocking her, sparks leaping into the air like fragments of her broken ties to the community. Her stepmother pushed her forward, the final betrayal, her voice dripping venom. "Do not come back," she hissed. "The village does not need your shadow." The girl stumbled into the darkness, the forest swallowing her whole. The murmurs of the villagers faded behind her, replaced by the haunting silence of the night. Every step forward felt like a knife in her chest. Fear twisted in her belly, despair tugged at her bones, but deeper still, something older stirred, a seed of rage, a whisper of strength not yet revealed. Behind her, the village dispersed. Some villagers carried satisfaction in their eyes, certain she would never return. Others carried unease, haunted by the image of her quiet endurance, wondering if perhaps they had just sown the seeds of something they could not control. But none dared to speak, for silence was safer than questioning the betrayal. Alone in the dark, the girl felt the full weight of abandonment. Her family, her people, her entire world had turned against her, casting her aside like refuse. The pain burned, but beneath it, something else began to smolder. The betrayal was meant to break her, to end her. Instead, it planted a fire in her spirit, a flame that would one day rise high enough to burn the village that had thought her weak. They believed they had sealed her fate. They believed they had buried her in shadows. But in their betrayal, they had given her the one thing they feared most, a reason to rise. The nights in exile were long and heavy, each hour dragging with the weight of silence that felt more suffocating than the villagers' cruel words ever had. Alone beneath the wide sky, she wrapped her arms around herself, not just to shield against the cold, but to hold together the pieces of a heart fractured by betrayal. Yet within that solitude, where no mocking voice could reach her, the girl found a strange stillness. She thought of her mother, a woman whose hands had always been roughened by work yet tender in touch, whose voice once told her that weakness was often mistaken for gentleness, and gentleness often carried a hidden strength. Those words, long buried under ridicule and pain, now flickered back into her memory like a dying ember refusing to be extinguished. She traced patterns in the earth with her fingers, remembering the stories of ancestors whispered in half-forgotten rituals, warriors who had endured storms, women who had survived losses, elders who had walked through fire and returned stronger. Could she not, too, belong to them? The more she thought, the more she felt the sting of her rejection sharpening into resolve. They had cast her out to silence her spirit, but in the silence she began to hear herself more clearly than ever before. Her tears, once symbols of weakness in the eyes of her people, dried into salt on her cheeks, leaving behind not despair but a fierce clarity. Each day of exile was a test, a chiseling away of her dependence on acceptance, and a shaping of her will into something harder, unyielding. Hunger gnawed at her belly, loneliness clawed at her heart, but beneath those trials a fire stirred. She remembered the way the village laughed when she faltered, the way her stepmother's sharp tongue lashed at her, the way elders dismissed her presence as if she were no more than a shadow. That memory no longer made her shrink, it fueled her. If they thought her frail, then they would never see her strength coming until it blazed in their midst. In that quiet exile, the girl whispered to herself words of survival, vows of return. She promised her mother's memory that she would not let the cruelty define her. She promised her ancestors that their blood would not flow weakly in her veins. Most of all, she promised herself that she would rise again, not as the broken, ridiculed child they had abandoned, but as someone they could neither dismiss nor destroy. In the heart of her isolation, pain became the forge and determination the flame. The nights no longer felt silent. In her exile, sleep became a trembling bridge between the world she knew and one that pulsed with mystery. At first she thought it was hunger and loneliness twisting her mind, But the visions were too vivid, too insistent to be illusions. She would close her eyes and the darkness behind her lids would flare with bursts of color, red as embers, gold as flames, black as shadows. Sometimes she saw faces, women whose eyes burned with defiance, men who carried spears glowing with firelight, elders whose lips moved in whispers she could not always understand. Their words came in fragments, heavy with weight, as though the air itself was pressing them into her soul. One night, she dreamed she was standing in the heart of a vast fire, the heat wrapping her but not burning her. Flames curled around her like living serpents, hissing and crackling with voices. In their roar she heard a message: what they mocked as weakness is your strength. What they cast aside is your inheritance. She woke gasping, her palms warm as though she had held embers in her bare hands. Fear jolted through her. What kind of force was reaching for her? But alongside fear came a pulse of awe, a trembling recognition that something had always been waiting, hidden in the marrow of her being, biding its time until now. During the days, two signs began to follow her. When despair made her weep, the wind carried warmth instead of cold. When she pressed her hands against the rough bark of a tree to steady herself, she felt a faint thrum beneath her fingers, as if the earth itself answered her touch. Shadows sometimes bent strangely around her, stretching in patterns that looked less like shapes of branches and more like the forms of ancestral figures watching silently. At first, she turned away from these happenings, whispering prayers, fearing she was cursed. But the more she resisted, the stronger the signs became, until denial was impossible. She began to sit in the evenings, closing her eyes, listening for the whispers. Slowly she learned to distinguish their tones. The stern voice of an ancestor urged endurance. A gentler one reminded her of compassion. Another, fierce, crackling like fire, spoke of vengeance. They did not always agree, but together they carved a path within her, showing her fragments of a truth too large to grasp all at once. She was not abandoned. She was chosen, bound to a legacy her stepmother and villagers could never understand. At times the signs terrified her. The vision of fire consuming her village appeared more than once, the flames not just destroying but reshaping, burning away cruelty and lies to reveal something purer. She woke from those dreams with her heart hammering, unsure if she was to be savior or destroyer. But even in her fear, she knew one thing with certainty: the secrets she carried now were dangerous, powerful, and entirely hers. For the first time in her life she was no longer defined by weakness. She had become the keeper of a hidden fire, and soon the village that cast her out would learn the cost of underestimating her. The first true awakening came not in sleep, but in the stillness of dawn. She had been gathering sticks for a fire, her hands raw from days of surviving alone, when the pile suddenly flared without spark or tinder. The flames leapt high, dancing orange and gold, but instead of panic, a strange calm filled her chest. The fire bent toward her as if bowing, licking at her fingers without burning, surrounding her in warmth that felt less like destruction and more like recognition. She knelt before it, her breath catching, and whispered aloud, "So it is true. I am not what they think I am." The words trembled in the air like an oath, and from that moment, denial ceased. She no longer questioned whether she carried something hidden, she knew. In the days that followed, she began to experiment, though clumsily at first. She would extend her hands, concentrating until her body hummed with heat, and sparks would scatter like fireflies. Sometimes it frightened her, the way power surged through her veins without asking permission, but with each attempt she learned more. She discovered that her emotions guided the strength. Anger called flames fast and fierce, sorrow brought them slow and steady, and calm steadiness allowed her to shape them. Once, while remembering her mother's gentle songs, she found the fire swirling like threads in the air, forming patterns that seemed almost alive. But fire was not her only gift. Shadows bent around her as if drawn to her presence, cloaking her when she wished to be unseen. Her ears picked up whispers of the forest, footsteps of animals, the sigh of branches, the faint echo of ancestral voices guiding her. At night, dreams became lessons. The ancestors showed her movements, stances, ways to steady her breath and anchor her spirit so her strength would not consume her. She would wake exhausted but strangely empowered, her muscles sore as though she had been training in the dream world itself. Day by day she sharpened her body alongside her spirit. She practiced in secret clearings, her bare feet steady on the earth as she moved with a grace that surprised even her. She learned to summon a flame the size of a candle, then to expand it into a roaring blaze. She learned to quiet the whispers when they threatened to overwhelm her and to channel them into action instead of chaos. The girl who had once bowed her head to cruelty now stood tall, her posture radiating command. Each time she looked at her reflection in the river's surface, she barely recognized herself. Her eyes glowed faintly in dim light, her skin seemed kissed by fire, her expression no longer timid but sharpened with resolve. There were moments of failure too. Once, when she let anger consume her during practice, the flames grew wild, scorching trees and leaving her coughing in ash. Another time, she tried to weave shadows for concealment but lost control, shrouding herself in darkness so thick she thought she might suffocate before breaking free. These mistakes terrified her, reminding her that power without discipline could destroy her as easily as her enemies. Yet she refused to let fear win. Each failure became another lesson, another step in her transformation. The hunger in her heart was no longer for food or comfort but for mastery. She trained until her arms shook, until sweat drenched her back, until her body ached with exhaustion. But when she collapsed at the end of the day, she felt something stir inside her. A core of strength forged not just from power but from endurance, from every insult she had swallowed, every cruelty she had endured, every tear shed in silence. The girl who had once been dismissed as weak was gone, replaced by someone dangerous, someone radiant with fire and secrets. As she mastered her gifts, she also began to imagine the future. She saw the faces of those who mocked her, those who betrayed her, and she felt no pity. They had believed her fragile, disposable. They had cast her into exile to erase her existence. Instead, she had returned from that exile as something far greater. She no longer longed for their acceptance. She longed for the reckoning that would make them understand. Yet beneath the thirst for vengeance, another current flowed, the realization that she was part of something larger than herself. The whispers spoke of balance, of destiny, of fire not only as destruction but as renewal. She carried within her the power to burn, but also the power to guide, to light paths others could not see. By the time the moon had waxed and waned, she was unrecognizable even to herself. Where once a frail, quiet girl had cowered under cruelty, now stood a woman carved of flame and shadow, her gaze steady, her hands steady, her spirit sharpened. Her stepmother's words no longer haunted her. The villagers' laughter no longer echoed with sting. All that remained was her strength, her secrets, and the certainty that soon, very soon, she would return to the place that had scorned her, and they would no longer see weakness. They would see fire walking. When she finally stepped onto the narrow path that led back into the village, there was no fear left in her. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the earth, but she walked through them as if she owned them, her back straight, her steps measured. She carried nothing, no bundle, no staff, no companion, yet she seemed heavier, as though something invisible walked with her. The children who played near the edges of the huts were the first to notice. They stilled mid-laughter, their eyes widening as they recognized the girl they had once mocked, the girl who was supposed to be gone. Whispers rippled through them before they scattered, rushing to tell their mothers what they had seen. The villagers turned to look as she passed. Some frowned in disbelief, certain their eyes deceived them. Others gasped, murmuring her name like a secret. But what unsettled them most was not her return, it was the aura that clung to her. She was the same and not the same. Her gait was steady, her face calm, but her eyes held a glow that made people avert their gaze. It was as if she had walked through a fire and returned not charred but refined, forged into something sharp and untouchable. Those who had plotted against her stood rooted, their mouths dry, their hearts pounding. They had imagined her body lost, her spirit broken. To see her stride into the center of the village was like watching a ghost refuse its grave. Fear gnawed at them as they tried to mask it with disbelief. "It cannot be her," one muttered, but his voice shook. Another clutched his robe tighter, as though that thin fabric could protect him from the unease curling in his belly. She said nothing at first. Her silence was heavier than words. People moved aside without being asked, leaving her a path straight through the heart of the village. Eyes followed her every step. Some villagers bowed their heads without realizing it, struck by the quiet command in her presence. Others drew back as though her very nearness threatened to burn them. The girl who had once lowered her gaze, who had once been the subject of laughter, now carried herself with a dignity that unsettled even the elders. At the central square she paused. Her eyes swept over the crowd, lingering on familiar faces, the ones who had mocked her weakness, the ones who had turned away when cruelty was done to her. None dared meet her gaze for long. There was no anger in her expression, no smile either, only a calmness that was far more frightening. It was the calm of someone who had endured the worst and returned stronger. It was the calm of secrets carried like weapons, waiting for the right moment to be unsheathed. A hush spread over the square as she stood there, her presence undeniable. She had not come with shouts or threats, but already the village trembled. Something in her silence told them that nothing would ever be the same again. The first challenge came not with fists but with words. One of her rivals, a man who had once laughed loudest at her supposed weakness, stepped forward, his voice trembling though he tried to sound bold. "This is no miracle," he said, forcing a bitter smile. "You should not be here. You should have perished where you were left. What trick is this?" His words hung in the air, desperate, meant to steady his own fear rather than convince anyone else. The villagers murmured, their eyes darting between him and the girl. She stood still, her posture unshaken, her gaze calm. Another joined in, a woman who had once called her a burden, who had whispered poison into the elder's ears. "You bring danger with you," she hissed. "Look at her eyes. They burn with something unholy. This is not strength. This is witchcraft." She spat the word like venom, hoping to turn the crowd against her. But the villagers hesitated. They saw not a witch but a girl transformed, a girl whose silence weighed heavier than the loudest curse. Then the elders stepped forward, their faces a mixture of authority and unease. The oldest among them raised a hand, demanding quiet. "Child," he said, though his voice betrayed a tremor, "if you have returned, tell us how. What force carried you back from death's door? Speak, so we may judge whether you come as one of us, or as something else." His words echoed, and the crowd held its breath. The girl finally moved. Slowly she lifted her head, her eyes locking with the elders. Her voice, when it came, was steady, neither loud nor hurried, yet it carried across the square with a force that made even the wind pause. "You left me to die," she said. "You thought weakness would be my grave. But it was in that place of betrayal that I found what none of you could see, the strength buried within me." Gasps rose from the crowd. Her rivals scoffed, trying to mask their unease. "Empty words," one sneered. "Show us then if you truly claim such strength." She did not move to strike or shout. Instead, she lifted her hand, and in that moment the air around her seemed to shift. A ripple passed through the crowd, as though the earth itself stirred beneath their feet. The rival who had mocked her staggered back, his face pale, though she had not touched him. Her eyes glimmered with something otherworldly, and those standing closest to her felt their hearts pound as if some unseen hand pressed against their chests. At first, the villagers thought it was coincidence, their minds playing tricks. But then she took a single step forward, and the ripple grew stronger, undeniable. The air grew warmer, heavy with energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. A torch set by the square flickered violently, its flames stretching toward her as though drawn by an unseen tether. The crowd gasped again, retreating slightly, but she remained calm, her face serene. "This is no witchcraft," she said, her voice quiet yet commanding. "This is the strength you tried to bury, the truth you feared I would one day uncover. You called me weak, but weakness is only what you see when you refuse to look deeper. Now look, and see me as I am." Her stepmother, who had hidden in the crowd, finally pushed forward, her face twisted with fear and rage. "You are nothing but a cursed child," she shrieked. "You shame me, shame this village. I will not let you," but her words faltered as her stepdaughter turned her gaze upon her. The girl said nothing. She did not need to. The stepmother's legs shook beneath her, her voice caught in her throat, as if the fire in the girl's eyes had burned straight into her bones. The villagers watched in stunned silence. What they had witnessed was not violence, not bloodshed, but a power deeper, older, and undeniable. Her strength was not in crushing others but in standing unshaken, in turning their fear back upon them. The rivals who had once laughed now found their mouths dry, their courage crumbling. The confrontation ended not with a blow, but with silence. The kind of silence that declared victory louder than any shout. For the first time, the villagers looked at her not as the frail girl they had dismissed, but as someone who had returned with a force none could deny. And they understood, with a shiver of awe and fear, that their world had changed forever. The girl stood at the center of the village square, the crowd pressing in around her. Faces that once sneered at her now stared with unease, some wide-eyed, others narrowed with suspicion. The night air was thick, heavy with the tension of what she might say next. For a moment she remained silent, letting their whispers swell, letting their fear ferment into anticipation. Then, with the calm of someone who had walked through death and returned, she spoke. "You thought exile would end me," she began, her voice steady, carrying through the hushed crowd. "But it gave me eyes to see what lies hidden in the roots of this village. You believe strength lies in mocking the weak, in casting out those who do not fit your mold. But that belief is a lie you have told yourselves for generations, a lie born of fear." Murmurs rippled through the villagers. The elders shifted uneasily, their authority quivering under the weight of her words. One of them opened his mouth to silence her, but she raised a hand, and the movement was enough to still him. Her gaze turned to the gathering firelight, and in its flicker her shadow stretched tall and strange, almost otherworldly. I learned in exile of our ancestors' whispers, she continued. They spoke of a curse carried by this village, not a curse of famine or plague but of cruelty. Long ago, when the first settlers raised their huts here, they betrayed one of their own. They bound her, abandoned her, and left her to die. And from that cruelty was born a sickness of the spirit, passed down through blood and custom. It is why you fear the weak, why you scorn compassion, why you think strength can only be proven through cruelty. You are living under the weight of an ancient wound. The villagers gasped, some crossing their arms as if to shield themselves, others staring as though the ground beneath them had shifted. One woman clutched her child close, whispering that she had heard fragments of this tale before, spoken in hushed tones by her grandmother. The girl's words gave those fragments life, weaving them into undeniable truth. Her rivals sneered, desperate to discredit her. Lies, one shouted, though his voice cracked. These are the ramblings of a girl who consorted with spirits in her exile. But his protest only rang hollow, for many in the crowd remembered the strange heaviness that hung over the village, the unspoken cruelties repeated like ritual. The girl's revelations struck deep because they resonated with wounds they all carried but never dared to name. She stepped forward, her presence radiating a quiet intensity. I saw visions, she said, of the ones you betrayed. Their voices came to me in dreams, not to curse me but to warn me. They showed me how your rituals are hollow, how your customs are poisoned. Every time you mock, every time you wound, every time you exile the innocent, you feed the very curse that binds this village. Do you not see? You left me for dead, and in doing so, you only repeated the sin of our ancestors. The elders exchanged worried glances. They had built their authority on these traditions, on keeping the village bound by fear. Now their foundation cracked as the crowd shifted, their loyalty wobbling between fear of change and recognition of truth. A young man from the back of the crowd stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. I too have felt this, he admitted. I watched my sister scorned and cast out because she was weak in body. We called it tradition, but in my heart I knew it was wrong. What she says, it feels true. One by one, others began to murmur, confessing memories of cruelties they had witnessed or committed. The girl's voice had peeled back the covering on their collective shame. It was not merely her survival they feared now, it was the truth she carried, truth they could no longer ignore. Her stepmother lurked near the front, face twisted in disbelief and fury. You dare accuse us all? You dare call our ways cursed? She hissed. But even her words lacked their former sharpness. The villagers no longer looked at her with respect, but with unease. Her cruelty, once ignored, now seemed like part of the very curse the girl had revealed. The girl raised her hand once more, her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The curse can be broken, she said softly, but not with blood, not with cruelty, not with the ways you have clung to for generations. It can only be broken by facing the truth, by ending the cycle, by choosing compassion where you once chose cruelty. The silence that followed was heavy yet charged. The villagers felt as though they stood at the edge of something vast, something they could not turn away from. She had revealed not only her own hidden strength, but the hidden rot within the heart of the community. Her words were not just accusation, they were a mirror, and in it the villagers saw their true faces for the first time. And in that moment, fear gave way to something else. The first stirrings of change, fragile but undeniable. The night was thick with silence, but her words lingered like sparks drifting through dry grass. The villagers dispersed to their homes, restless and unsettled. Yet beneath the quiet, something stirred, an unease that grew heavier with every heartbeat. The girl stood in the square alone, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the sky. She could feel it, the weight of generations pressing down, demanding release. It was not just her vengeance that smoldered within. It was the wrath of ancestors whose cries had gone unheard for too long. At first, the flames appeared small, faint embers licking at the thatched edge of an abandoned hut near the field. Some whispered it was an accident, a stray ember from the cooking fires. But as the blaze spread, rising higher, it seemed less like chance and more like judgment. Roofs glowed red against the night, and the wind carried the fire's breath across the village, fierce and unrelenting. People rushed to fetch water, but the flames roared louder than their cries, defying every effort to control them. The girl did not run. She stood still, her face illuminated by the inferno, and in her eyes there was no fear. Whether the fire was summoned by her power or born from the secrets she had revealed, it moved with purpose. The villagers felt it too, the sense that this was not destruction for its own sake but a cleansing. Their houses, their rituals, their silent cruelties, all were fuel for the fire. Every scream, every desperate attempt to save possessions or relics, was met with the relentless crackle of wood surrendering to flame. Some dropped to their knees, crying out to the ancestors for forgiveness. Others turned to the girl, their faces streaked with ash and tears, demanding she stop it. But she remained calm, her voice carrying over the chaos like a low chant. "This is what you have sown," she said. "Generations of cruelty, generations of silence. Fire does not come to destroy the innocent, it comes to purify what is corrupt." The stepmother staggered forward, her voice shrill and breaking. "This is your doing. You brought this curse upon us." But even as she shouted, sparks leapt from the burning huts and clung to her clothing. She flailed, shrieking as the villagers backed away, watching her stumble into the dirt. The girl's gaze did not waver, she offered no rescue, only the truth. "Your hatred fed the flame," she said quietly. By dawn, the village was unrecognizable. Smoke coiled into the sky like a signal to the spirits, and the land was marked by charred remains. Yet from the ashes rose something more profound than ruin. The people stood together, stripped of their comforts and traditions, forced to confront the truth she had spoken. The fire had not taken all, it had spared the people themselves, leaving them alive to rebuild. But they knew they could not rebuild the same way. The girl walked through the smoldering ruins with calm steps, her figure wreathed in the lingering smoke. To some she was a curse made flesh, to others she was salvation. Either way, the fire had sealed her place in history. She had burned away the lies, the cruelty, the false strength of a village that had underestimated her. The flames were her vengeance, but they were also her justice, a fiery rebirth that no one could forget. The sun rose over the ruins, casting a pale light upon the smoke that still curled from the blackened earth. The village was quiet in a way it had never been before. No laughter, no quarrels, no pounding of pestles in the mortar. Only the crackle of dying embers remained, and the heavy silence of people forced to reckon with what had been lost. Ash clung to their skin, their hair, even their breaths, as if marking them all with the weight of their own deeds. One by one the survivors gathered in the square, the ground beneath them still warm from the fire's fury. Their eyes avoided hers at first, filled with shame and fear, but it was not long before whispers grew into confessions. A man stepped forward, trembling, admitting how he had once mocked her when she was weak. A woman followed, weeping, confessing how she had turned her back when cruelty was done. The words poured out like water breaking from a dam, every voice a mixture of guilt and desperation for forgiveness. The girl stood in the center, her gaze steady, her silence pressing them to speak truth. She listened, not with bitterness, but with the calmness of one who had already seen beyond vengeance. Still, when her rivals approached, the air grew heavier. Her stepsister lowered her eyes, no longer boasting, her pride turned to ash like the homes around them. The elders shuffled forward, their voices cracking as they tried to justify the cruelty they had allowed to flourish. And then came her stepmother, wild-eyed and broken, her once sharp tongue faltering into pleas. "Spare me," the woman cried, falling to her knees. "I was blind. I was cruel, but I am your blood." The villagers turned to the girl, waiting. Would she strike her down? Would she let the fire finish what it had begun? Her voice carried softly but firmly. "Blood does not excuse cruelty. Nor does age excuse silence. Each of you must bear the weight of what you chose to do, or chose not to do." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "But the fire did not come to kill you. It came to show you the truth. What you do with it now will decide your place in what remains." Judgment followed. The rivals who had tormented her were stripped of their standing, their names spoken with shame instead of honor. Some were exiled, sent to wander until they could learn humility. Others were forced into silence, no longer allowed to speak in council. The stepmother was spared her life, but condemned to live in disgrace, every villager turning away from her as she once turned away from the girl. Yet there was mercy too. The children, the innocent, and those who had confessed their wrongs with sincerity were spared. She chose not to rule through fear but through wisdom, showing that vengeance had its place, but justice demanded balance. By the day's end, the villagers understood that she was no longer the girl they had mocked. She was something greater, judge, witness, and survivor. And in her presence, they saw the possibility of a new beginning, if only they dared to embrace it. Years passed, and the village that had once burned beneath her fire was no longer the same. The scars of ash faded, homes were rebuilt, and new generations grew up hearing whispers of the girl who had returned with secrets fierce enough to shatter the pride of an entire people. Children gathered around their elders at night, their wide eyes glowing in the firelight as the story was retold again and again, of the girl who was mocked, betrayed, abandoned, and yet came back carrying flames of truth and justice. They called her many names. Some spoke of her as the bearer of secrets, the one who walked with shadows and fire. Others called her the silent flame, for she had endured mockery in silence until her truth roared like a storm. Mothers used her tale to remind their daughters that weakness seen by others could be strength hidden deep within. Fathers told their sons that cruelty had a cost, and that arrogance could turn even a thriving village to ash. Her stepmother's disgrace became a cautionary tale, woven into the story like a thorn. "Beware the cruelty of envy," the storyteller said, "for even the one you despise may carry a power greater than your own." The elders who had once ruled with silence were remembered as warnings too, examples of how cowardice could destroy a community from within. But above all, her name was remembered not with fear but with awe. Festivals arose where fires were lit in her honor, not to destroy but to illuminate. Flames became symbols of resilience, truth, and transformation. Young girls braided red threads into their hair, whispering her story as a blessing. Warriors carried charms marked with flame patterns, a reminder that true strength did not always show in the body but in the spirit. The village's laws changed, shaped by the memory of what had been lost. Mockery of the weak was forbidden, for no one could know what hidden power might sleep inside another soul. As years stretched into generations, her story traveled beyond her village. Wandering griots carried her tale from one settlement to another, across valleys and rivers, until people who had never seen her face spoke her name around their fires. Each retelling carried a different shade. In some she was a goddess disguised as a girl, in others a mortal who had been chosen by the ancestors to deliver justice. Some even claimed she still walked among them, watching, ready to return if cruelty grew too bold again. But to those who remembered her most closely, she was not a goddess nor a myth. She was a girl who had once been called weak, who had endured humiliation, betrayal, and pain. She had chosen not just vengeance but wisdom, leaving behind a legacy stronger than fire. Her story became a lantern passed from one generation to the next, lighting the path for those who felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated. And so the weak girl became eternal, not through her body but through her legend. She was the secret bearer, the flame in the ashes, the one who proved that no silence lasts forever, and no cruelty goes unjudged. Long after the smoke of her vengeance had faded, her fire burned still, alive in every heart that dared to rise after being cast down.